Right.
Right.
So what we're going to do is we're going to get the pre-stuff out of the way. So first and foremost, I want to say thank you so much for attending today's training. We're trying to do as much free training as we can for people, especially the fact that so many people have a lot of time on their hands right now being quarantined. This particular edition of this training for threat hunting is brought to you by Wild West Hacking Fest. The next Wild West Hacking Fest will be at the end of September in Deadwood, South Dakota. You may wonder what possibly could bring you to South Dakota, this conference. Deadwood is a cool little gambling town. We completely take it over with a bunch of people who don't gamble, which I think is always funny. But we bring in the best InfoSec luminaries in the world to come into Deadwood, South Dakota. We have tons of hands-on exercises, lots of workshops, and this year we'll be having about 7 training classes. More importantly, Wild West Hacking Fest will be split. Will be ground-based, and all of the events will also be streamed. So you can register for a virtual ticket or you can get a ground-based ticket. The advantage of a ground-based ticket is you get a free steak dinner. That's right. We buy steak and potatoes and beans and salad and all kinds of stuff for every single one of the attendees. It's also brought to you by Backdoors and Breaches. Good luck getting a set. This particular game has been selling out constantly. As soon as we put it up on Amazon.com, we should get some new cards out there here shortly. But once again, with the COVID-19 pandemic, it's making it a little bit difficult to sell anything on Amazon at the moment. We're currently working out a plan to get those out there, but check it out. It's also brought to you by Black Hills Information Security. We do pen test, red team, threat hunting, webcast, open source tools. We now do HTalk services, which we'll talk about here in a second, so check that out there. Also brought to you by AI Hunter. We're going to talk about open source tools and techniques today, but at the very end, if people can hang out, we're going to talk about a commercial product that is basically a nice wrapper, front-end GUI, and kind of a streamlining engine for Rita, which we'll talk about throughout the training. Also, HTalk. Hunt team operation centers. If the idea of setting up full network threat hunting is a bit daunting for you, be sure to check out HTalk services from Black Hills Information Security. This is where we come in and set it all up for you. So that was my fast, open introductions. The other thing I wanted to say is we are offering more free training this Thursday, April 9th, just right around the corner, from noon to 4 Eastern United States time. This is going to be very similar to what the active defense and cyber deception class is going to be like. We'll have training, we'll have a VM that people can download, we'll walk through labs, we'll walk through different concepts. So check that out. That's going to be this next Thursday. Like I said, a lot of hands-on coming on. As a whole, we already talked about Wild West Hacking Fest, so let's go ahead and let's get started. You may want to take out your phones at this moment and just take a quick picture of this slide. The reason why you want to take a quick picture of the slide is it has the URL, which is also in the chat in GoToWebinar, and it also has all of the passwords to get set up for this virtual machine. Now, you could use VMware, you could use VirtualBox. I strongly encourage VMware. I tend to have fewer issues with VMware than I do with VirtualBox, but that's just me, personal preference. There's some people in here that are VirtualBox ninjas. You can go either way that you want. And when you get into the virtual machine, the user ID is thunt, and then the password is AYBAB2U, which is all of our base, all your base are belong to you. So that's logging into the VM. And we won't actually get to the lab portion of this particular class until the end. So don't panic, don't freak out. You can start downloading and importing and running these things as we're talking about the various topics. So we're waiting for everybody to get their pictures of the slide so that they have it. We have a link to the VMs in the chat. We also have a link to these slides as well, available to absolutely everyone. Now we're going to be covering about 5 modules. Guessing that it's 30 minutes each because Chris said that they're 30 minutes each. I'm running the same slide deck that Chris came up with. I've modified the slides, added in some additional things onto it as well. And the last module is almost all hands-on, and it might take a while. We're just going to hang out and help people through. I'm going to take a 10-minute break at the top of each hour, and then we'll fill this time with banter and questions and potty and drinks and things like that. And the team is monitoring your questions. We have a great team. We have Deb is here, Jason's here, Chris is here, Bill's here, Keith is here, KC is here. I'm sure I'm forgetting someone.
Shelby.
We have Shelby is here as well. We have a whole bunch of people on the chat of Discord and also on the chat for GoToWebinar. I would ask that your questions specifically related to the content material get placed in GoToWebinar. If you have any off-the-cuff things like cat pictures, pictures of my male model, John Strand doppelganger, that you want to post, please post those in Discord where I won't see them. We have a number of people watching those questions, and if something percolates up, they'll interrupt and they'll ask me, and that's perfectly cool. There's a number of different topics that we're going to be covering today. We're really going to be focusing on the basics and fundamentals of command and control and how we can approach network threat hunting as a process. I'm going to shut off my camera because I need to pace. So when people are thinking about network threat hunting, there's a lot of discussion as far as what threat hunting is and what it isn't. And we're going to throw our hat in the ring on what we think cyber threat hunting actually is and how it relates in the world of computer security. But I think the most important thing that Chris Brenton has developed as it relates to this is an overall process. And you can actually see our blog posts on this as well at activecountermeasures.com. Now, we're going to go through what you can look for as primary key identifiers for looking for and identifying command and control traffic leaving your environment. Now, one of the things you're going to learn about this class is we can identify a lot of automated traffic leaving the environment, and we will be looking at identifying malware, of course, because that's what people are looking for. But there's a large number of other things that you can identify as well. Policy violations. We'll talk about things like TeamViewer and LogMeIn. We'll talk about people that are streaming movies all day long. And we'll also get into some things like crypto miners and browsers. All of these kind of fit into this category of kind of remote access command and control into your environment. And we'll be talking about those primary identifiers and what we can consider to be secondary identifiers for command and control traffic as well. It's weird, what we consider to be a secondary like modifier for identifying command and control is really what many organizations, especially with standard threat intelligence feeds, consider to be the primary indicators of command and control. And a little bit later on, I'm going to talk about the idea and the concepts of durable versus ephemeral threat intelligence. When you're trying to identify adversarial traffic in your environment, what are some indicators of really strong, durable threat intelligence? And what are things that are very ephemeral, things that change very quickly? Now, this class is heavily focused on open source and free tools, and we do that for a solid reason. We do that because if you're looking at early adopters and you're looking at people that are really kind of at that pointy end of the spear, coming up with network threat hunting tools and techniques, open source is where it's at. Eventually, commercial tools start to pick up and catch up on the different techniques that are being utilized, but most commercial tools are at least 2 to 3 years, sometimes longer, behind the curve of what people are using right now to effectively detect adversaries. This creates a gap in timing between what types of techniques attacks are using and what types of tools we're using to try to detect them. And we want to get you up kind of the front of that wave. Also, we have command and control labs. In fact, if I'm talking about a specific topic that may be boring to you or you're familiar with it, you can jump to the end of the slides and you can simply do the labs. So you can do those hands-on labs whenever you want. So you can do them during the breaks, you can do them while I'm talking, or you can wait till the end of class. However, I would request, if you're going to ask me questions, please don't ask me questions about the labs if we haven't gotten to them yet. It creates this really rough disruption in the slides themselves, because then I start talking about a lab and people start panicking. They're like, where are the labs? I don't see any labs. No one told me about any labs, but they're all at the end and you can do them at any time that you want. One of the things I really wanted to discuss as we were starting out this course is the way we really should be thinking about defense in depth. And if we go back in time, defense in depth had this weird connotation of, I have a DMZ. In my DMZ, I have an intrusion detection system. In my DMZ, I have an intrusion prevention system. In my DMZ, I have a firewall. And then from that firewall, I have antivirus, right? And it was like layering a whole bunch of defensive techniques on top of the endpoint between the internet and then that particular endpoint. And that specific way of thinking of defense in depth worked when you were looking at things back in 99, 2000, 2001, 2, 3, and 4, where a lot of the attacks were, coming from the outside, trying to hack in through the DMZ and gain access to the internal network. However, over time, that thought process needed to evolve. We needed it to be something a little bit more dynamic and effective at protecting the endpoint. And I'm just using this as an example, folks. This isn't actually a Venn diagram that you should all, copy, paste, print, put out on your wall, make a tattoo of it. But it's creating a visibility kind of Venn diagram showing you overlapping fields of visibility. Anytime you're thinking of any secure asset that you're trying to protect, you shouldn't be looking at the number of layers that exist between the internet and that specific asset that you're trying to protect. That really was a broken methodology of defense in depth. And one of the main reasons why that layered approach broke is because you can have a layer of a firewall, IDS system, IPS system, you can have antivirus, and that's great. It's all protecting that system from the outside coming in. But a lot of the attacks became client-side attacks, became browser-based attacks. So your browser could access the internet, bypass all layers, and then the attacker could bypass those layers as well. Further, when you're thinking of that type of model really goes back to an external exploitable service that somebody can try to hack, right? That's really focused back in like the mid-2000s methodology of trying to protect your network. And the reason why is if you're looking at the way attacks ultimately work today, there's multiple points that you can get visualization and get telemetry on an attack while it happens. You can have things like user and entity behavioral analytics that can help protect the endpoint. You're looking for those login anomalies of that workstation moving laterally in your environment. You can look at that user account, and that user account is trying to log into multiple workstations, or a user account is trying to access multiple files. That's not something the traditional layered kind of view of defense would ever detect. You can also look at endpoint protection with like EDR, right? If you're looking at tools like Cylance, or you're looking at things like CrowdStrike or Cybereason or SentinelOne, you're talking about an advanced endpoint protection suite of tools. However, as good as those tools are, which are infinitely better than traditional blacklisting utilities, it still creates blind spots, right? Like what's happening on that system. We can get improved logging and analysis with tools like Sysmon. So you have a lot of these tools that already exist, right? People are buying user and entity behavioral analytics in SIEM. They're buying advanced endpoint security products. But we realized a number of years ago that there was a massive blind spot in most environments whenever it came to network level detection, especially in the area of command and control. So if an attacker got to the point where they could get malware on a system, mainly us at Black Hills Information Security, and we could get that traffic to beacon out of the environment, once we had bypassed the EDR, the tool like Cylance or CrowdStrike or any of those tools, it was pretty much game over because they only had those tools. They didn't have user and entity behavioral analytics. They didn't have the network telemetry that they needed. And further, their mindset was pretty fundamentally broken. So kind of, stepping this through a little bit to set the stage, we have people all the time that talk to us about, well, if I'm running Cylance, does that mean I'm protected? If I'm protected, if I'm running Carbon Black, does it mean I'm protected? If I'm running CrowdStrike, does it mean I'm protected? And the answer is, by itself, no. So what happened is a number of years ago, we got very frustrated with Cylance. And by the way, there's a happy ending to this story. We got very, very, very frustrated with Cylance because Cylance was actively going after a lot of security researchers, and they were basically trying to quiet them or silence them for finding bypass techniques within their product. And there was always this implied threat of a non-disclosure agreement. There was always this implied threat that they would sue someone if they went about talking about how somebody could bypass their product. Now, there's a number of problems with this, none the least of which is the Consumer Fairness Protection Act basically invalidated those gag clauses whenever you buy a product. You can talk about a product as much as you want, even if it's in the legal document and it says, oh, you can't talk about our product publicly without talking to us first. All of those clauses and contracts were retroactively invalidated. So what we did is we decided to go after Cylance publicly. Now, as a pen testing firm, we do between 400 to 450 security assessments per year. Our whole purpose in life is breaking into places at Black Hills Information Security. So yes, we know how to bypass Silence and CrowdStrike and some of those tools. And that gets into a longer conversation of configurations and things of that nature. So what we did is we bypassed this product using 4 different techniques within a week. And every single day of the week, we released a new bypass technique. Now, there's 2 things about this. One, it really freaked a lot of people out because they thought that these products were completely foolproof and no one could ever bypass these products. And this kind of shot that entire illusion of security completely straight to hell. The other thing that's kind of terrifying about this is the techniques that we used a number of years ago, we still use many of these exact same techniques today. And that's terrifying. We may use variations of these techniques, but we still use these techniques today. If you want a series of webcasts on this topic, we have a series of webcasts that you can find on YouTube where we've done this every single year, not just for one specific vendor, but we've done this for all of the different vendors that we can get our hands on. And we talk about our various techniques that we utilize. And we share that with the community as a whole. So I'm going to put that out there right there. Now, I'm talking about that as that relates to this class. And I'm showing that because, not because I want to say Cylance is garbage. As I said, there's a happy ending to this. The happy ending is very simple. Cylance went through a rough patch. Actually fired a lot of people, not necessarily because of what we did, but now we have a very good working relationship with companies like Cylance and CrowdStrike. They're not actively trying to sue researchers that find bypass techniques, and they're working with a number of security companies to develop better detection methods that are not specifically based on a signature. So things got better. But it took us breaking a product and doing it publicly to actually get that vendor to the table to start having these conversations. We also do the sacred cash cow tipping where we bypass these endpoint security products. We do this webcast because we want everyone to understand that there is no security technique that you can utilize that is 100% foolproof. That's why you need multiple overlapping fields of visibility. And the network, for the longest time, has been a huge blind spot in organizations. I just put up on the screen the MITRE ATT&CK technique matrix. And there's a couple of things I want you to take from this particular slide. The first thing is on the right-hand side, I put a red rectangle around the methods that we're going to focus on in this specific webcast. We're going to focus on how your organization can effectively detect command and control leaving your environment, and you can detect data exfiltration. Now, the problem with many organizations is they are completely blind to command and control techniques, and they are completely blind to data exfiltration. Sure, some of those environments and some companies, they may have data loss prevention products, but I'm here to tell you that data loss prevention never, ever gets in the way of our penetration tests. We're not like, oh my God, they have this DLP product and it completely shut us down. It doesn't work. There are so many ways to bypass traditional DLP that it's just ridiculous. DLP does in fact have its place though, and I know that's weird. I rip on DLP, but at the same time, I say it has its place. DLP has its place specifically in the realm of keeping honest people honest. You want to make sure that your people aren't sending out emails with social security numbers or credit card numbers. DLP will work for that. If you're trying to stop a determined attacker that knows a variety of different encoding techniques, you're pretty much hosed. So we need to develop better techniques for that. If we're looking at command and control, I'm going to share with you a couple of different backdoors. We're going to talk about DNSCAT. We're going to talk about VS Agent. These are backdoors that you can get and you can run. Other tools like Cobalt Strike that have a variety of different encoding and obfuscation techniques to make it next to impossible to rely on signature-based detection to identify them. And a number of years ago, when we started this voyage of network level detection using tools like Rita, we started because there was literally nothing that could detect what we were doing effectively to get command and control out of an environment. Now, the rest of this stuff we're not going to get into, right? We're not going to get into endpoint security. That's going to be a threat hunting webcast and training session that's going to be a little bit further on down the line. We're actually currently working on tools and utilities that will assist you in doing doing a threat hunt on the endpoint, where we can start doing long tail analysis of applications that make network connections. So we'll talk about that at a later session, but this session is going to be focused exclusively on that network level detection. So let's talk about our first module. So we're going to get started and we're going to discuss malware history. We're going to talk about what is threat hunting specifically on the network, and then some really basic and fundamental command and control detection techniques. Now, the one thing that I want you to know and take from this is there is a world of difference between the techniques that pen testers are using and the techniques that actual adversaries are using. And this is a bit of a problem in the industry. It doesn't mean that network pen testing is worthless. It just means that sometimes they diverge predominantly out of necessity more than just being lazy. So I'll explain what that looks like and how a little bit later. So let's kind of start at the very beginning. Why is it attackers actually try to break into networks? I think that there's some weird things in the industry afoot at the moment. So if we take a step back and we look at traditional infection, right? If you go back to early 2000s or mid 2000s, there was infection through predominantly remote exploits, right? You would have 08, 067, 03, 026, and you could remotely exploit systems. And of course, we've gotten into things like Eternal Blue, we got into Petya, we got NetPetya, WannaCry. We have had some remote exploits that have popped up over the past few years, and those are definitely interesting. But when we're looking at how a targeted adversary, and that's key, how a targeted adversary breaks into your network, their techniques are relatively simplistic. From a conceptual framework, right? Get a user to go to a website, get them to run a client-side exploit, or more often than not, get them to download and execute something with malware in it, and then take over their computer systems, right? And that concept of mass propagation really went by the wayside, and it has been replaced by targeted attacks against organizations. So I'll give you an example. We talked about Conficker, right? For a long time, even 10 years after a Conficker's initial exploitation, it still maintained access to over 1 million computer systems, right? And we saw flare-ups of Petya, NotPetya, and WannaCry, right? Even though WannaCry was taken down by a malware tech blog by simply registering and standing up a domain, which was kind of cool. But by and large, the vast majority of attacks that you're going to encounter, the ones that you're really worried about, are the attacks where somebody is coming after your organization directly. So now it's all about monetization. And monetization can actually happen in a variety of different ways. We've seen a huge uptick in ransomware, right? Where attackers will take over a computer system, and then in order for you to decrypt the files on your computer system, you need to pay them money. That has been automated for an extended period of time. However, recently, we're seeing some attackers where they'll take over a system and the attacker will actually interact with that computer system, move around the environment, ascertain the level of finances that that environment that they can bear, and then they will lock the system out. And in many situations, they'll work on persistent, maintained access to that environment. So we're seeing this huge monetary cycle associated with ransomware, whether it's automated or whether it's an actual individual or human being that's behind that automated malware, or not automated malware, that malware that they're deploying as well. So when we're thinking like an attacker, it's focused on making a profit. You also have nation state attackers, and profit may not be the primary driver for nation state attackers, but we also need to think about those level of attackers as well. So when they're taking over those internal computer systems, I want you to keep in mind that there's three main things that every adversary is going to do. One, they're going to try to escalate privileges. Two, they're going to try to move laterally. And three, they're going to establish command and control. Every attacker is going to do those three things. We're going to focus on the third. We're going to focus on that command and control within the environment itself. So can't get there from here, right? The idea of a firewall is interesting. It's beautiful. I was talking with Marcus Random, and Marcus Random gets uncomfortable whenever people say he invented the firewall, because he's like, I didn't. But he's one of the first people that developed a framework and a toolkit that would become firewall technologies. And he gets very uncomfortable about that. But every once in a while, whenever he's not quite in the right state, maybe he's been drinking or something, he will say, I gave the world a beautiful thing in the form of firewalls. And then immediately they shot it right through the middle with port 80. They shot it right through the middle with port 443 and basically rendered the thing useless. And there's some truth to that, right? Most organizations let traffic outbound of their environment. They do little to any filtering whatsoever of what leaves their environment. And then they allow very, very, very restricted ports and services coming in. And this is truly an artifact of that old school layered defense of thinking, right? Our defense is in this perimeter. Our defense is this firewall. Our defense is this IDS system that's sitting in this DMZ. Bad is on the outside, good is on the inside, and we are going to be protected. But when we're looking at modern adversaries, they can put that malware on a computer system, and then that outbound connection, that egress connection from the infected computer system goes outbound. And there's very little, if any, scrutiny of what leaves an environment. Sure, there'll be some basic checks for web filtering. If you're using something like ForcePoint or Blue Coat, there'll be some checking on what websites you go to. Maybe you're running something like an advanced firewall from Palo Alto or Fortinet or Cisco that's actually verifying that the protocols that are being used match. So if something's leaving on port 22, we want to make sure that it's actually SSH traffic and not malware. But problem is, even with that, the attackers can make their malware look exactly like HTTP traffic. In fact, it is HTTP traffic. We've seen attackers that can tunnel their traffic over port 22 SSH or a non-standard port still using SSH. So they can fool a lot of these systems by making their traffic look like legitimate traffic leaving the environment. And this is ultimately where we went wrong. With traditional intrusion detection systems, a tremendous amount of the focus was detecting initial compromise. For years with Snort and then eventually with Saracata, the entire effort was around how do we detect someone attacking one of my systems? And this makes some level of sense as a human being. You're going to focus on the initial attack, right? You don't want to get hit in the chest with a baseball bat. You want to avoid that. If somebody's swinging it at you, you want to avoid that. However, as we were focusing on these external attacks coming into the environment, we got very lax in our ability to detect outbound attacks. It used to be a tremendous amount of the traffic was over port 6667 for IRC or clear text HTTP. And the attackers never really had to flex any muscle or skill in getting out of environment because people weren't monitoring anything. Then people started monitoring and they went encrypted. The problem is, as soon as an attacker goes encrypted or encoded, there's almost no way that you can effectively detect that command and control using traditional methods. Sure, you can do SSL interception or TLS interception. You can try to do that. Most organizations don't do that because of privacy concerns. Sure, you can try to intercept that traffic and analyze it, but even if you do, they can still encode within that traffic itself. A little bit later, I'm going to share with you a backdoor called VS Agent. And VS Agent does all of its command and control in an __ view state parameter for ASP.NET servers. It's base64 encoded, and it's variable in length, and it's variable in content type. So how do you even begin to write a signature for something like that? The answer is you can't. So even if you have an SSL decryptor or TLS decryption, it doesn't matter because the attacker can simply use encoding or double encryption on the inside as well. However, there's a hint here. On this slide, you can see that you have this thing that says, is there anything you want me to do? Wait 600 seconds. Is there anything for me to do? Wait 600 seconds. When we started this entire investigative process, and this really started with Lawrence Hoffman, started with Brian Furman, the concept and the framework was there's going to be consistencies in attacker traffic that the attacker didn't know was going to be there. And interval is one of the absolute easiest ways that we can identify those consistencies and possibly flag those consistencies for detection. So if we can find those consistencies, then we have the capability of changing the way we look at defense and detection. And originally they started with DFFT, discrete fast Fourier transforms. Those tend to be fairly slow for finding frequency spikes in large data sets. And then they started doing pen tests and other things. And then Lisa Woody, our lead research scientist here at Black Hills Information Security and Active Countermeasures, took the idea and really morphed it. We're going to talk about what she started and what a bunch of other people came on board and started working with for trying to identify these types of consistencies, especially when we talk about a free open source tool like Rita. So how does the attacker get in? Well, pretty much the way they have been getting in for decades now: phishing and spear phishing. Send an email into an organization, send and spray, right? It's opportunistic. Whoever's going to open that link is probably going to get compromised. Then there's also spear phishing. Now, spear phishing is really interesting. Many of us are running email proxies, right, that are taking email, they're checking the email, they're checking, a whole bunch of different things like SPF records, and they're making sure that everything looks secure and the domain checks out. And there's been some research over the years on how to bypass those different products, things like Proofpoint. So one of the techniques that came out at DerbyCon last year was some security researchers were able to reverse engineer what were the dirty word and clean word lists for the email filter going into an organization. That means what type of word coming inbound would automatically flag an email as something you do not want. It'll just be really kind of crass, but it gets the point across: penis. If that's in an email, just automatically quarantine that, shut it off, right? And there's a whole bunch of words that are like that, or phrases that you just want to filter out and categorize as spam or advertising. And they're constantly using a variety of different algorithms to categorize these words as bad or good. Now, we can all sit down and we can come up with a list of known bad words. But what about known good words? Well, that's what these researchers were able to identify. They found out that if you just simply put spreadsheet in an email, in many of these different email filtering products, as soon as they saw the word spreadsheet, they let it through, because the amount of attacks that came through that had an XLS or a spreadsheet or any of those things as keywords was lower. Or they would also put in specific additional rules that they didn't want to break anybody that was sending spreadsheets, because those could be mission critical documents coming into an organization. They wanted to make sure that those were allowed in. So getting bypass techniques for these products is something that we do, and every red team and every pen testing team in the world knows how to do. They do it constantly, and there's really no solid protection. You can reduce the flow of malicious emails coming into your organization, but it's impossible to completely stop the flow of malicious emails coming into your organization unless you use a wire cutter and clip your network connection to the internet. Further, whenever you're looking at what are the fail rates for phishing attacks, there's a wide variety of different articles about the failure rates for phishing attacks. And our experience is it really depends on the type of fish that's being utilized. If you just do a general UPS delivery notice, you're probably going to have about 20% of the population is going to fall for that specific spear phishing attack. So not great. But if you start getting really targeted, like for $5 here in the United States, we have a bunch of people international, we can get this from different services available. But for $5, I can identify every single loan that you have. For $5, I can find your social security number, I can find your address, I can find all your previous addresses, I can get a list of your family members, license plates for your cars. I can then spend another $10, do that license plate lookup and track your car through red light cameras or parking garages, anybody that has camera data that they're sharing out with users. I can get all of that information about you. So now imagine that I create a spear phishing attack for you, and I'm able to reverse engineer and identify that you have children. Some of you do have children. I'm just using this as an example, and some of you don't. So for those of you that have children, I'm able to identify who your kids are. And based on your kids, I'm able to identify their social networking platform, and they're sharing all kinds of pictures. And I find out that they play soccer. I take the pictures, I geolocate the EXIF data associated with that specific picture that they took, and I can find the latitude and longitude, find the field where your kids play soccer. I then find what team, based on the jerseys that your kid plays soccer on, identify who the coach of that team is, and then I send you an email from your coach saying practice schedule has changed. Please click the link for an updated practice schedule. The number of people that are willing to click on that just went way up. This is what they call the creepy line at Google. You know, how close to the creepy line can you get before people really start to freak out? And the answer is pretty close. So whenever you're looking at that targeted attack, the percentages go way up. When you look at general propagation of just crap spam, like click this link for a UPS notification, or flowers are being delivered, click here to set up delivery, it goes down. So it depends how much effort the attacker actually puts into it. Further, whenever you're looking at what real attackers do, whenever you click that link, where exactly does that take you, right? That's something that's interesting. And this particular slide I added in because it really creates a little bit of a difference in the way that a pen tester does things and an attacker does things. And every once in a while, I'll be on Twitter and somebody in the InfoSec community will say, to all you pen testers not using real attack tactics, you need to up your game and you suck. That just tells me they have no clue what they're talking about at all. And the reason why they have no clue about what they're talking about whatsoever is there's techniques and tactics that a pen tester uses that an attacker would never use. And there's techniques and tactics that an attacker would use that a pen tester would never, ever use, like this one. So this is actually from a threat hunt that we did, I think last year or 2 years ago. And we had a whole bunch of beaconing traffic that was leaving an environment and it was going to a medical website for a small doctor's office. And that was a bit suspicious because the doctor's office was in a completely different part of the country from where the organization that we were doing a hunt team was at. Now, the interesting thing was this particular doctor's office website was actually whitelisted as a medical community website. And what we did is we ran a simple port scan against that particular website. And these are all of the different ports that we discovered. We saw domain was open, 80 was open, 443 was open. We had a bunch of 2000 ports, but the one that really got me interested were two at the bottom. One was port 2222, which was the port our beaconing traffic was going to, and then port 3306, which is MySQL. So just looking at this, just with a port scan, and we didn't do a Nessa scan or try to exploit the service because that's illegal and I don't want to go to jail, but just looking at this with multiple ports open, specifically the database port being open, and just seeing the beaconing traffic, it's fairly easy for me to assume that this website had been compromised, most likely through credentials for MySQL. And then they were using it as a command and control server on port 2222, which is a commonly used backdoor. So we were able to research this and identify this. Now, this right here, folks, this is a technique that my company will never do. We will never, ever exploit a web server and then use that web server as our command and control server. We're not going to do it. So if you're looking at it like, oh, well, pen testers need to up their game and do the techniques attackers do, we're never going to do this, ever. But it highlights some techniques that pen testers will do that'll kind of blend into this, okay? So the whole concept is fairly basic. Find a trusted website, I'm using air quotes, that is allowed outbound for the proxy traffic leaving this particular network, and then put your command and control server on that trusted quote unquote website. We can do the exact same thing as pen testers, but we have to do it in different ways, all right? So one of the ways that we would do this is we would do, let's say, domain fronting. All right, this is actually a technique in the MITRE ATT&CK technique matrix, and a bunch of tools that we use like Cobalt Strike allow us to do this. So we will absolutely use domain fronting. And that's the same concept. We're using a content delivery network as our command and control server as a bounce. The other thing that we could do is we could use tools like GCAT. This is a backdoor that we wrote at Black Hills Information Security, and it's currently being maintained by ByteBleeder, who's Marcello. And this uses Gmail as a backdoor, right? This was used by the Russians in the Ukrainian power grid attack. We could also use tools like Sneaky Creepers by Dakota Nelson. He wrote it while I was at Black Hills Information Security. And what Sneaky Creepers does is it uses Twitter, Tumblr, SoundCloud, Salesforce, and Google Spreadsheets as its command and control. It bounces the traffic off of these services. Now, when you're looking at these two different things, the overall concept is the same. We're going to use a trusted resource, and we're going to bounce our command and control off that trusted resource. The tactics to get there are going to be different. An attacker would take over a third-party website, and we would use third-party services to actually effectively use that as our command and control server. What this ultimately means for you as defenders is you need to be able to detect and defend against both. You're not going to look at this as, well, we just got to detect adversaries that we're going to be setting up threat emulation for. We're not going to be defending against pen testers. You need to be equipped in such a way that you can handle an attacker that's bouncing their traffic off of a website for a hospital that they've compromised, and you need to be ready to be able to detect the attack of a real pen testing company that does this as well. Another example, crypto mining. With crypto mining, we're looking at kind of a wave of attacks that we have seen over the years where the overall process is different than ransomware, and the overall process is different than just standard exploitation. In this scenario, the attackers desperately want to gain access to resources, but they want to maintain access to those resources for an extended period of time. They are not interested in just smashing and grabbing. And this, I actually think, depending on the value of cryptocurrencies, I'm going to get some water going for coffee. Depending on the value of cryptocurrencies, it really depends how many attackers you'll see doing this. So CoinHive was a great website and a resource where you could develop your own code that you put on your website that would do Monero mining, and it was available, and it's been replaced by King Miner and a bunch of other tools that are out there. But the overall point stays the same. An attacker takes over a system. They can either do this by inserting their mining software directly on that system, or they can take over a system through just installing a plugin or running something within the browser. Either way, it stays the same. Now, by and large, a lot of these different crypto mining attack tactics that attackers are using today, well, set up servers, once again, on somebody else's server. All of the agents or the miners that they put on the inside of the environment will respond back to the main crypto mining server. And then it'll basically, as they crack, or it's actually they're doing a hash lookup, looking for a specific hash value that begins with certain numbers of zeros. Whenever they hit that, then they get paid out because they were successful in actually mining that specific currency, right? So what you can find by doing threat hunting is, this is an example of a threat hunt that we did. Once again, I think it might have been the same one that I had on the previous slide, where we found a bunch of miners working on this environment, and they were beaconing out at regular intervals. And when we scanned that system, and then we actually made some connections to that system on port 8080, we were able to pull down a list of all the workers in this environment and other environments, and how much CPU utilization and overall quote-unquote power it was using on that system. Now, I use this as an example. Once again, this is not something your pen testing company is going to do, ever. We're not going to set up crypto mining on the inside of an environment because we would get sued into oblivion. But the problem is, this once again creates a blind spot in that organizations basically try to defend what a pen tester does, and they start ignoring everything else because it didn't show up in a pen test report. So we need to be able to detect these techniques as well. Next slide, problem space. This is something that gets progressively worse as we go through it. Out of 1,200 organizations that are surveyed, 71 were breached. That's in 2018. Less than 50% of the breaches get detected internally. In fact, it's far worse than that. 40% of organizations think that they're threat hunting. They're actually not. It's unfortunate that many organizations think that threat hunting is simply buying a product that does signature-based detection, and then it automatically threat hunts for them. No, that's what your EDR's job is to do. That's what your firewall's job is to do. Taking atomic or static indicators of compromises, doing searches in your environments for hashes, for IP addresses, for code snippets, that's what they should do, but it's not threat hunting, and I'll explain why here in a couple of seconds. But the big one is, at the bottom, on average, 191 to 197 days to identify a breach, and then 66 to 69 days to contain it by the Ponemon Institute. And I think the reason why is because we have such massive blind spots in organizations where we're missing so much, because we got so focused on traditional intrusion detection, we got so focused on traditional endpoint protection that we started ignoring the network. We started ignoring what our logs were providing and what our logs weren't providing. And that created a huge gap. So here's the Verizon data. We've got time. I'm going to go through it. So this is from 2019. So the question is, how did an organization discover that they were breached? And there's some really terrifying trends on this particular chart. I want to highlight one of them. The first thing I want to highlight is in red, I added in these little rectangular boxes on the left-hand side. Every single one of those detection techniques that organizations discovered that they were compromised, every single one of those techniques is external, an external monitoring service. Look at this, 16% overall. Small businesses very small, and large businesses was 42.9%. Was from like a managed detection response firm or an MSSP. External fraud detection, external customer, 18%. Actor disclosures 4, actor law enforcement, unrelated third party, incident response team. That means you're working one incident, you find another. External security researcher, that would be like a bug bounty program. Monitoring service, external other, I don't even know what the hell that is, but other. External fraud documentation, and then external emergency response team. Everything that's left over is internal. So that means if you're looking at log review, overall, it's 1.3%. Small businesses, it's 1%. And then I think I went off base. And then on the outside, it's 2.2% for large organizations. So your SIM and doing event log analysis, best case scenario is 2.2%. These numbers are really, really frightening, and they should be frightening. But it ultimately shows what happens whenever an industry gets ultimately stuck in a rut of doing the exact same thing over and over again and consistently expecting that there's going to be different results. Now, there are people that say, well, you know what? Those are just organizations that suck at security. They probably weren't doing things right. And I'm here to tell you, when we pen test companies, we tend to pen test a lot of companies that have very solid security practices. They tend to be very good. They're the ones that are running the advanced EDR products. And these numbers hold. It's not just bad companies or companies that are bad at security. This is a systematic failure of detective capabilities across the industry as a whole. If we add all of these up, 69.7 roughly of the detects that happen in organizations come from outside of that organization, not from their internal SIM, not from their internal security technologies. They come from the outside of that organization. And that is coming from the overall percentages. It's actually worse if you go over the large companies. But the main point for this is we need to pause, we need to reflect, and we need to start looking for creative and new ways of trying to detect attacks, because traditional signature-based detection does not work. And with that signature-based detection not working, that means that if you're using these technologies and you're saying you're threat hunting, you are not threat hunting. If your threat hunting incorporates a blacklist, doing a check on just simple blacklist, that is not threat hunting. That is literally what your IDS, IPS, and firewall should be doing literally every day. I had a student of mine, he came up. I was talking about threat hunting and intel, threat intel feeds, and he came up and he was like, look, man, I hear what you're saying about threat intelligence feeds, but I need you to know that my job is doing threat intelligence. And last year, 2 times, we went through and we were searching for threat actors on our environment, and 2 times last year, we were able to detect them. And that's fantastic. And when I rip on threat intelligence and I talk about it in this way, I need you to understand I'm not disparaging the skills of anybody. But whenever people are going through and they think that they can take indicators of compromises and then they can do a search across their entire environment better than your antivirus, better than your firewall, they're delusional. And if you do IOCs and you do these types of searches, it says less about your skill as a security researcher, which may be extreme and very solid. And it says far more about the failings of your endpoint security product and the failings of your firewalls to detect these things that they ultimately should have detected. So this calls for something being different whenever we're looking at threat hunting. So whenever we're looking at threat hunting, we're looking at a proactive validation of a network's integrity. We need to be looking at systems. We need to be looking at notebooks, cell phones, tablets, IoT, assuming the worst and looking for the worst as though it is actually out there, right? We're going to look everywhere. The purpose of threat hunting is to try to reduce this time frame. We have all these different protection technologies, and you can see that a lot of the internal protection technologies are not effective against the breaches that Verizon has documented. And you see the same thing in the Mandiant reports. You'll see the same thing in various Ponemon Institute reports or Gartner reports. You're seeing the exact same themes again and again. And most of the time, what's being told to you is go buy more of the technologies that have gaps. So we're trying to reduce that 6 months to detection down to something that's much faster, if at all possible, less than 24 hours. And I know some people are like, whoa, we want to do instant. Instant is really hard. Unless you're doing signature-based detection against standard run-of-the-mill crap malware, trying to detect a real attacker needs to take time usually. Threat hunting is not a pure blacklist detective solution. Threat hunting is not going through and pulling down indicators of compromise from a threat intelligence feed and then going through that in your environment. Your endpoint security should do that. Your firewall should do that. That is literally their job. Threat hunting is not provided by an EDR. It isn't. And it is ultimately not waiting for the easy button to get hit in an organization as well. So simple terms of network threat hunting. We are going to look for unknowns and we're going to look for anomalies. We're going to create better filters and then we're going to repeat that process again and again and again. And I have people ultimately say, well, that's just a lot of work. Yes, it is. It is absolutely a lot of work. That's why we have employment. It was never easy. It's not going to be easy moving forward in the future. Everyone in this industry that's in the vendor space and a lot of people in management are trying to find a way to get rid of everyone that's on this webcast. And they're constantly being sold products for security orchestration and automation. And they're constantly being told that they have a single pane of glass that'll do all of this for them. And it's an oversimplification of what security is. And all of it is targeted at getting rid of you. All of it is targeted at trying to oversimplify a problem and make that problem go away so they don't have to have security teams. Meanwhile, the complexity of everything continues to explode. We continue to have more IoT devices, interconnected devices, cloud devices. New technologies are coming on constantly. And you're not going to be in a situation where there's going to be a magical easy button. So yes, it is difficult. Find the unknowns and the anomalies in your environment, identify and quantify those that are not evil, create better filters, and then continue looking for evil in your organization. That's what security was back in 2000. That's still what it is today. And these tools are great. They can help with that. But it's still going to require us to have some level of understanding on how to do this. And the goal of this class is to make this as easy as we possibly can make this for you, with open source tools and techniques and making them available. Do we have any questions from people at all? Jason and Chris? And
I think the biggest one was you mentioned being able to get personal information for $5. What's the source for that?
So if you go to a TransUnion, this is just one place. OXP, I think, is what it is. You can get an account with these different groups. You basically have to register as a legitimate company. And traditionally, these are used for background check investigations for companies whenever they hire employees. And they're also used for private detectives, and they're also used by law enforcement. In order to get an account for something like this, the only thing you need to do is have a place of business that has a sign of your business up front. You have a locking filing cabinet in your office at some point. They have someone come out, check your company, and then you get an account. And then you're basically charged for every single lookup that you do. And those lookups are about $5.
Yeah, most folks don't realize just how easy that is.
Yeah. I was told when I got this, the person came in and gave me some recommendations. And they're like, okay, so the first thing you don't want to do, once you get into this, you don't want to start doing searches for Taylor Swift. Don't do Taylor Swift searches. Apparently, they have flags on famous people that if you start searching on famous people, stalkers try to get access to this, and they will shut your account out. Not that I've ever tried, but I've never really had a need to do that. So, all right, any other questions?
Yeah, we had a question about, so how do I do this in a cloud environment? There's actually a webcast we just did on how to do this in Amazon. Now that they support port mirroring, Google and Azure are moving in the same direction, although there's still beta testing their equivalency of port mirroring. So we're kind of testing that out now. We'll have webcasts on it later. One of the comments that I thought was really funny, though, John, was, am I allowed to cry now with all those statistics?
I don't think so. I don't think you're allowed to cry. Look, what we're going to talk about here in the techniques that we do, it's kind of, Chris can talk about whenever he came on to active countermeasures, but a lot of the techniques that we're doing is the same crap that we did, Chris, I would say 20 years ago, right?
Yeah, just better
Like
tools now.
we have better tools. And it's kind of, there's no school like the old school. You don't have to cry, but you do have to start digging. And this class is hopefully a first step. We're going to give you a bunch of tools and techniques that you can use.
Yeah, I would also say rather than cry, turn it into a presentation to help get more budget from upper management.
Yep. Yep.
Because if it
And
scares you that much, it'll scare them too.
And the best thing you can do, we'll show you these techniques. If you show them Rita and you're like, look, we've got 23 people streaming movies constantly from India. Yeah, that's going to get their attention. It's going to get their attention for sure.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
I got an interesting question here. Would like to see how this can be tailored for today's situation where large amounts of people are teleworking.
Yes. So the way that this actually gets set up, well, the whole world shifted literally overnight, right? So a lot of companies that started doing this correctly, they basically shut down split tunneling. So all of their users work remotely, and whenever they make their VPN connection comes into their environment, and then it turns around and it goes outbound. So you still have that visibility for the network and the traffic that exists. Now, that's ideal, right? That's absolutely without question the ideal. However, many organizations got ramped up so fast that they didn't have the bandwidth on their VPN concentrators to handle that much traffic that wasn't split tunneling. So what many organizations are doing out of necessity is they're split tunneling. If you're accessing resources on the inside of the environment, then it goes down the VPN. If you're trying to access resources out on the internet, then it's actually going to connect directly outbound. So this is a little bit of a preview. I'll show you guys on the next webcast that we're going to be doing on this topic. We're going to do a hard shift very, very, very quickly. And we're going to be talking about that specifically and how you can actually do that type of analysis and how you can do it on an endpoint. So we're releasing an open source tool. This is actually Beaker right here. And we put in a filter, clear filter out. So what we're discovering and the things that we're going to talk about is you can actually still get the connection logs from a system. This is a backdoor that's using PowerShell. This user account executed it. And then what you notice is at the bottom, we scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that there's tons of connections for this. So you're seeing this particular backdoor execute again and again and again and again and again and again. And you can still see the number of connections per hour is very, very consistent. We have a very flat histogram. So we'll be talking about doing this type of analysis using network traffic, but in our next webcast, when we pivot to the endpoint, we're going to talk about how to do it using Sysmon and Elk stacks as well.
I got a couple for you, John.
Yeah.
One that popped up that I think is definitely worth talking about is how do you get C-level buy-in for this type of thing? In other words, okay, you're preaching to the choir. I believe you. Yeah, we need to be doing this. How do I get approval for that? How do I get budget for the tools?
So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. Let me show you real quick. This is a spreadsheet that was created by some good friends of ours, James and Kelly Tarala. So if you go to audit scripts and you go to the critical security controls, Chris was actually there at the beginning of the critical security controls. Actually, he was there at the top 10 and a bunch of other
Yes.
too. So the critical security controls, there's two main spreadsheets that you want to pull down. There's the assessment tool, and then there's the security controls master mapping. And if we open up the assessment tool, it's going to open it up in numbers. It still works, but it's ugly. What's going to happen if it opens? There we go. So this particular breakdown actually breaks down all of the controls, and they're across usually the bottom in Excel. And you can see each of the critical security controls. And one of the critical security controls is inventory of hardware, and the other one is inventorying of software. A lot of the network monitoring, when you're looking at Brozeek, will actually take that off the table for you. It'll just do that, and it's going to do it automatically. There's also network-based detection in here as well. That's all about monitoring of networks and looking for anomalies, right? So we have that, right? That's actually in the critical security controls. Now, where this gets wicked cool is this. So what James and Kelly did is they actually cross-referenced the 20 critical security controls. Wait for it, here we go. They actually cross-referenced the 20 security controls to every other audit framework on the planet. So they've mapped it to NIST, NIST security, critical security framework. They got NIST 853, ISO standards. We have the anti-terrorism standards, NSA top 10. GERC top 10, PCI, HIPAA, SWIFT, Saudi AMA, NERC SIP compliance. So whenever you're fighting this, you never want to make a fight of you think it's a good idea. You want to make it a fight that's basically someone disagrees with you and there's an audit compliance standard that says that thou shalt do network security monitoring. And that network security monitoring requirement is cross-referenced to over 50 other audit requirements. So it's not you versus the CISOs. You bring it to their attention, this is a requirement, and it's mapped to all of these. It then becomes a conversation of the CISOs versus every audit and compliance requirement on the face of the planet.
So as far as like, how do you get C-level buy-in? Step one, talk their language. Meaning, if I go to a CISO and I say, we need to do this to be more secure because secure is good and we don't want to be unsecure, they're not going to care, right? What I find makes folks really successful at their job is being able to translate what we know into other languages. Step one for me, so imagine I've gone into a new organization and we want to get some new security controls in place like threat hunting. What do you do? First thing I want to do is I want to understand risk to the business, not just security, but overall. Do we look like we might get sued? Do we have a retention problem with existing customers? Put it in that context, meaning if I go to a CEO or a founder and I want to have some of my security efforts prioritized, I need to recognize what else is being brought to them as a priority. Because if the web server is not locked down, but the retention rate is, less than 50% on our product, meaning like people will subscribe to our product and over half of them drop within the first 3 months, it doesn't matter. We can't lock the website down. If we don't fix that retention problem, we're going out of business. That's kind of how a CEO operates, is what's going to put us out of business by tomorrow? That's my first priority. What's going to put us out of business within 2 or 3 days from now? That's my next priority. You need to kind of get it in scope with that. Start talking that language. If your organization has a legal team, sync with them. Be their friend, be their advocate, because that way they will be yours. And like I said, that'll help you key in on what are the risks to the businesses, to the business itself, and put it in that context. To say we need to lock it down because it's part of this attestation compliance, yeah, okay, that's fine. But to be able to say, hey, we could lose customers, we could lose money, and here's the easy to follow roadmap on how that might happen, that's going to help kind of get things prioritized. The other thing I like to do is change the language so that security is not looked at as being overhead within the organization. Security is always looked at as a money suck, right? We're looked at as the folks that we need to spend a lot of money on and we don't get anything back. Your job as a senior security person is to change that language. I'll give you a really good example. I had one organization I was working with that didn't want to spend money on security. So what I did is I connected with sales and I looked at our sales process. And what I found was some large customers they were going to would look at them and say, oh, yeah, you don't have your security in play. We don't even want to talk to you. Okay, there's a deal that was just completely lost that they couldn't even try and negotiate with. For the deals that they were winning, what would happen is they would come in and say, hey, do you have your PCI, ISO 27001, SOC 2, whatever it is they were interested in? Do you have these attestations? And if the answer was no, they said, okay, we have this small questionnaire with 700 questions on it that you need to go through and answer. And when you answer it, there'll be some things we don't understand. So we're going to ask you for clarification. And then we'll probably ask for clarification again. And then we'll need the legal folks to talk to each other. Okay, what do you think that does for the sales cycle? That extends it out at least 3, maybe 6 months. Now your argument becomes, hey, if we implement these security controls, I can shorten our sales cycle and I can open up market verticals that are not available to us today. So go to a CEO and say, we need to be secure because it's a good idea. Yeah, you're going to get brushed off. But go to them saying that you can actually enable sales, and now security is perceived completely differently within the organization. So yeah, that's just kind of my spin on that. So someone was asking, what's the difference between threat intelligence and threat hunting? Threat intelligence is a feed. Think of it as like 1990s antivirus, right? So in 1990 antivirus, we ran software on our systems that the manufacturer would push down signatures to match on to let us know if we had any badness on our system. It's basically what a modern day threat intel feed is. We get a list of hosts, we get a list of IP addresses, and we're told they're bad. If they're bad, we should try to avoid them or investigate when we talk to them or whatever the case may be. Threat intel can be helpful. I don't like that to be one of the pillars of how I'm securing my network, mostly because when you look at what comes through in a threat intel feed, a lot of it is dynamic IP space. So for anybody who's used Amazon, you know that if I shut off my VM, wait 2 seconds and turn it back on, I get a different IP. So the bad guys kind of cycle what they use as a source all the time. So if the threat intel information is, let's say, 24 hours old, it's helpful to me. If it's 3 months, 6 months, yeah, not so much. Threat hunting is actually, it is an active search of your environment to see, do I have indications of compromise? Do I have indications of, C2 type communications? It's completely different. So threat intel will probably be a feed from some third party. Threat hunting is something that either you're going to do yourself or you're going to hire somebody to do on your specific environment.